The phone rang at 2:07 a.m., slicing through the silence of my bedroom with a sound so sharp and out of place that it felt physical, like a hand grabbing my chest and squeezing. I had been half asleep, drifting in that shallow space where thoughts blur into dreams, when the vibration rattled against the nightstand and pulled me violently back into consciousness. I remember the exact second my eyes focused on the screen, because that was the moment my body reacted before my mind could. My heart started racing, my hands went cold, and every instinct in me screamed that something was wrong, long before I even processed what I was seeing. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything, but first, if you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% viewers who click on the like button. It makes us really happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories. It will be great to tell us where you are watching us from in the comment section. My mother's name was on the screen. Not a notification. Not a missed call log. An active incoming call, glowing softly in the dark like it had every night she used to call me years ago. For a brief, disorienting moment, my brain tried to correct the image, to substitute it with something logical, an old contact glitch, maybe, or my eyes misreading the screen in the dark. But the name didn't change. It stayed there, steady and unmistakable. My mom had been gone for 3 years. I had stood at her funeral. I had held the program with her photo on it. I had watched the casket lowered into the ground. And yet, my phone was ringing with her name like none of that had ever happened. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. I sat up in bed, staring at the screen as if it might blink or correct itself if I waited long enough. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow, the air in the room suddenly too cold despite the heater humming softly in the background. I told myself this was grief playing tricks on me, some delayed emotional response triggered by exhaustion or stress. I had read about things like that. How loss can surface unexpectedly, how the brain can replay familiar patterns when it's overwhelmed. But this wasn't a memory. This wasn't a thought. This was my phone ringing in my hand. When the call stopped, I didn't feel relief. I felt dread. A second later, a voicemail notification appeared, and my stomach dropped so hard it made me dizzy. My fingers hovered over the screen, trembling, every part of me screaming not to press play. I already knew what it would sound like. Or at least, I thought I did. I told myself it would be distorted, robotic, obviously fake. That belief lasted exactly until I heard her voice. Clear. Familiar. Tired in the way it always sounded when she called late. She said my name first, softly, the way she used to when she didn't want to wake anyone else in the house. Then she said, "Open the door. I'm cold." I dropped the phone. It hit the floor with a dull thud that echoed far louder than it should have, and I scrambled backward until my back hit the headboard, my heart pounding so violently I could feel it in my throat. I covered my ears like that might erase what I'd just heard, like sound could be undone if I refused to accept it. That wasn't a generic voice. It wasn't close enough. It was her. The cadence, the slight catch in her breath, the way she pronounced certain words. Those details were etched into me from a lifetime of hearing them. No one forgets their mother's voice. And hearing it again like that felt less like fear and more like a fracture. My first irrational thought was that she was outside. Standing in the dark. Cold. Waiting. The thought was so vivid it made my legs tense as if preparing to move, to get out of bed and walk toward the door without thinking. That scared me more than the call itself. I had always considered myself practical, grounded, someone who relied on facts rather than feelings. And yet, grief has a way of bypassing logic entirely. For a split second, the part of my brain that still missed her, that still reached for her in moments of stress, wanted to obey. Wanted to open the door and end the ache of absence once and for all. I forced myself to stand, my movements slow and deliberate, afraid that if I rushed I would lose control completely. I picked up the phone again and replayed the voicemail, this time holding it away from my ear, as if distance could protect me. The message was the same. No background noise. No distortion. Just her voice and those words. I checked the call log, my hands shaking so badly I had to steady them against the wall. The call came from a number I didn't recognize, but the contact name was still hers. I hadn't changed it since she died. I hadn't had the heart to. Seeing it now felt like a cruel reminder of how easily old wounds can be reopened. I walked through the house turning on lights, needing brightness, needing proof that I was awake and not trapped in some elaborate dream. Every familiar object looked slightly wrong, like I was seeing my own home through someone else's eyes. The hallway felt longer. The front door loomed heavier than it ever had before. I stood several feet away from it, staring at the lock, listening for any sound that might confirm or deny the impossible thought that had lodged itself in my mind. There was nothing. No footsteps. No knocking. Just silence pressing in from all sides. I told myself again that there had to be an explanation. Phones can be spoofed. Voices can be recorded. Technology can do unsettling things if someone wants it to. I repeated those facts like a mantra, clinging to them as anchors while my emotions pulled me in the opposite direction. Still, logic didn't erase the way my hands shook or the way my throat tightened every time I looked at the door. The message hadn't asked how I was. It hadn't said my name again. It hadn't said anything that required a conversation. It had been a command. Simple. Direct. And that specificity made it harder to dismiss. I sat on the couch with the lights fully on, phone clutched in both hands, replaying the voicemail over and over despite myself. Each time, I noticed something new, a pause that felt intentional, a softness that mirrored how she used to speak when she was worried about me. Memories flooded and uninvited, her standing in the kitchen late at night wrapped in a sweater, complaining about the cold, her knocking on my door when I lived at home, asking if I was awake. Grief has a way of blurring past and present until they overlap in ways that feel painfully real. By the time the clock read 2:31 a.m., I was no longer questioning whether the call had happened. I was questioning what it meant. Someone had used my mother's voice. Someone had known exactly what to say to cut through every defense I had. And whether they intended it or not, they had succeeded. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't since the day she died, like my private grief had been dragged into the open and reshaped into something threatening. I didn't know who had done it or why. But as I sat there staring at the door, I understood one thing with chilling clarity. Whatever was happening wasn't finished yet. I didn't sleep after that. I sat there until the sky outside the windows began to lighten, the house glowing with artificial brightness while the world beyond it slowly returned to normal. The contrast felt wrong, almost mocking. Birds began to stir, cars passed occasionally on the road, and life carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Inside me, though, everything was suspended in that moment at 2:07 a.m., looping endlessly. I kept replaying the voicemail, even as every replay made my chest tighten more. I wasn't looking for comfort anymore. I was looking for proof, some small flaw, some digital stutter, anything that would allow me to categorize the message as fake without having to argue with my own memory. Grief has a way of undermining certainty, and I knew that intellectually long before that night. I had lived with it for 3 years, felt its quiet persistence in unexpected places, in grocery store aisles and late-night silences. I knew how it could sharpen nostalgia and blur edges, how it could make the past feel closer than it really was. That knowledge turned inward now, becoming suspicion. What if this was me? What if exhaustion had finally cracked something open? What if my mind had reached for my mother's voice because I still wasn't done missing her? The idea terrified me more than any outside threat. A stranger using her voice would be horrifying, but my own mind betraying me would mean there was nowhere left to feel safe. I checked the call log again, zooming in as if proximity might reveal something new. The number was still unfamiliar, unlisted, offering no immediate clarity. I searched it online, then again with different formatting, my fingers moving automatically while my thoughts lagged behind. Nothing useful came up. No reports. No obvious scams. That absence of information fed the doubt instead of easing it. If this were a known trick, wouldn't there be warnings? Articles? Someone else talking about it? The silence made me feel isolated, like I was standing at the edge of something no one else could see. By mid-morning, I called my sister, even though I already knew what she would say. I didn't tell her everything at first. I softened the story, framed it as a strange call, a glitch, something unsettling but not alarming. I watched carefully for her reaction, searching for validation or alarm in her voice. She paused, then sighed gently and told me I was probably overtired. That stress does strange things. That grief can resurface in ways that feel real. She wasn't dismissive, she was kind. And somehow, that kindness made the doubt worse. If she had reacted with shock, it might have anchored me. Instead, her calm suggested this was internal, manageable, explainable. After we hung up, I felt strangely alone. Not abandoned, just untethered. I wandered through the house again, retracing the path I'd taken during the night, standing where I'd stood when I stared at the door. In daylight, it looked ordinary. Unthreatening. Just wood and metal and familiar scuff marks near the bottom. I pressed my ear against it, feeling ridiculous even as I did it, half expecting to hear something I'd missed. There was nothing. The rational part of my brain seized on that absence eagerly. See? It said. Nothing happened. But the emotional part whispered back, not yet. I tried to work, answering emails mechanically, my responses delayed and imprecise. Words blurred on the screen. Every notification made my stomach clench, every unfamiliar number sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I replayed my mother's voice in my head even when the phone was silent, the phrase I'm cold echoing with a familiarity that hurt. She used to say that all the time, usually as a complaint, sometimes as an excuse to stay on the phone longer. The specificity of it gnawed at me. If this was a hallucination, why that phrase? Why not something more generic? Why something that fit her so perfectly? I started to question my own memories, and that was when fear truly took hold. Grief can rewrite the past subtly, smoothing edges, amplifying certain moments. I wondered if I was projecting details onto the voicemail that weren't really there. Maybe the cadence wasn't exact. Maybe the pauses only felt familiar because I wanted them to. I recorded the voicemail on another device and listened again, forcing myself to analyze it clinically. The result was the same. My emotional response didn't lessen. If anything, it intensified, because now I was aware of how desperately I needed this to be unreal. In the afternoon, a friend stopped by unannounced, sensing something off in my voice earlier when I'd cancelled plans. I debated whether to tell them the truth, weighing the relief of sharing against the risk of sounding unhinged. I told them anyway. Watched their expression shift as they listened. They didn't laugh. They didn't accuse me of imagining it. But they did suggest stress, unresolved grief, maybe even a prank by someone who knew about my mom. The last suggestion landed differently. A prank implied intent. Knowledge. Access. That thought stayed with me long after they left, settling into a darker, more concrete shape. By evening, the narrative in my head had split into two competing explanations, both equally terrifying. Either my grief had finally found a way to mimic reality with terrifying precision, or someone was deliberately using my mother's voice to reach me. One explanation meant I needed help. The other meant I needed protection. I didn't know which frightened me more. What I did know was that dismissing the call outright no longer felt possible. Too many details resisted erasure. Too many reactions felt rooted in something external, something that didn't belong solely to my inner world. When night fell again, I felt the tension return full force. Darkness pressed against the windows, and the quiet felt heavier than it had the night before. I kept my phone face up on the table, volume turned all the way up, bracing myself for another interruption. I told myself that if it rang again, I would know that this wasn't a one-time glitch or a stress-induced echo. The minutes stretched, each one carrying the weight of expectation. I realized then how easily fear can teach you vigilance, how quickly your body learns to wait for danger once it believes it's possible. At 11:46 p.m., my phone lit up again. Same contact name. Same unfamiliar number. And in that instant, the argument that this was all in my head collapsed completely. I didn't answer the call when it came the second time. I couldn't. My body locked up in a way that felt automatic, protective, like something deep inside me had taken control and decided that movement would make things worse. I watched the phone vibrate against the table, the screen lighting up the room in that same soft glow, my mother's name hovering there like a dare. This time, there was no shock, only confirmation. Whatever had happened the night before hadn't been a singular fracture. It was a pattern. And patterns, unlike grief, don't happen by accident. When the call stopped, I waited longer than necessary before touching the phone again, as if it might burn me. Another voicemail notification appeared, and my stomach twisted, but alongside the fear was something else now: focus. I pressed play without flinching, bracing myself not emotionally, but analytically. The voice was the same, unmistakable, precise, but the message was different. Shorter. More urgent. She said my name again, then added, "Why aren't you answering? You know I hate being locked out." That detail hit me harder than the first message. My mother did hate being locked out. It was a trivial thing, something she complained about constantly when I was growing up. Too trivial. Too specific. Grief can blur memories, but it doesn't invent details that precise on command. That realization settled in slowly, bringing with it a cold clarity that pushed panic to the edges. Someone had access to my mother's voice, yes, but more than that, they had access to our shared history. They knew her habits. Her phrases. The small, unimportant preferences no one bothers to remember unless they've lived with you or studied you carefully. This wasn't random. This wasn't a scam that cast a wide net and hoped someone would bite. This was targeted. I started documenting everything. Times. Numbers. Exact wording. I replayed both messages side by side, listening not as a grieving child but as someone searching for seams. There were none I could hear. No awkward splices. No mechanical flattening of tone. If this was artificial, it was disturbingly sophisticated. The thought made my skin crawl. Technology had always felt abstract to me, useful, distant, something that lived behind screens. Now it felt invasive, intimate, capable of reaching directly into my most vulnerable memories and repurposing them as leverage. I called my sister again, this time without softening the story. I played her the voicemail. I waited in silence while she listened, watching the pause stretch on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, stripped of the easy reassurance she'd offered earlier. She agreed the voice sounded like Mom. She didn't try to explain it away. That mattered. But when I asked her if Mom had ever said those exact words to her, about being locked out, she hesitated. Not to me, she admitted. That confirmation tightened something in my chest. The messages weren't generic memories pulled from public recordings or old videos. They were tailored to me. That was the moment the fear shifted into something sharper. Violation. Someone had gone digging through my life, my history, my grief, and come back with tools designed to bypass my defenses. I thought about who might have access to recordings of my mother's voice, old voicemails, videos, family group chats. I thought about the people who had been around after she passed, the arguments over her things, the boxes of personal effects that had been divided and redistributed. At the time, it had all felt mundane, administrative. Now, it felt like a trail I'd never thought to secure. I spent the rest of the night researching voice spoofing, reading articles that made my stomach churn. The technology existed. It was improving rapidly. And all it needed to work convincingly was material, samples, patterns, data. The more I read, the more one truth became unavoidable: whoever was doing this hadn't just stumbled onto my number. They had prepared. And preparation meant intent. By morning, I had stopped questioning my sanity. The doubt that had gnawed at me all day before receded, replaced by something colder and more actionable. I wasn't imagining this. And I wasn't alone in it. That realization didn't make me feel safer, but it did give me a direction. Fear thrives in uncertainty. Knowing that this was deliberate, even if I didn't yet know by whom, gave me something to push against. Still, one question refused to let go. Why now? My mother had been gone for 3 years. Whatever recordings existed had existed that long. If this was about money, leverage, control, why wait? The timing felt intentional in a way that unsettled me deeply. It suggested urgency. Or opportunity. Or proximity. I began to wonder whether this wasn't just about hearing her voice, but about getting me to do something specific. The messages hadn't asked for conversation. They hadn't asked for information. They had asked for access. Open the door. That phrase replayed itself in my mind, no longer as a haunting echo of grief, but as a tactic. A test. I walked to the front of the house and stood there again, staring at the lock, imagining someone on the other side counting on muscle memory and emotional reflex to do the rest. The idea made my hands curl into fists. Whoever this was, they weren't trying to comfort me. They were trying to get inside, physically, emotionally, or both. As I stepped back from the door, my phone buzzed with a new notification. Not a call this time. A text message. From the same number. It read, "I don't have much time." And in that moment, I understood something with chilling certainty. Whoever was using my mother's voice wasn't just trying to scare me. They were getting closer. The knock came just after midnight, less than an hour after the text appeared on my phone, and it was nothing like the frantic pounding my imagination had been rehearsing. It was slow. Measured. 3 deliberate taps that echoed through the house with a confidence that made my skin crawl. I froze where I stood, every muscle locking in place as if my body had decided movement would be a mistake. The quiet before and after the knock felt intentional, like whoever was on the other side knew exactly how silence amplifies fear. My phone lay on the counter behind me, screen dark now, but I could still feel its presence like a pulse, a reminder that this moment hadn't arrived by accident. I didn't approach the door right away. I stayed exactly where I was, listening, counting my breaths, forcing myself not to react the way I would have before all of this started. Grief would have sent me running. Habit might have too. But something had shifted in me since the calls, since the second voicemail stripped away my doubt. I knew now that this wasn't about comfort or confusion. This was about pressure. Timing. Control. And opening the door without thinking was exactly what they wanted. That knowledge steadied me even as my heart hammered against my ribs. Another knock followed, identical to the first, just as calm, just as patient. Then a voice spoke, muffled slightly by the door but close enough to feel intimate. It wasn't my mother's voice this time, and the relief I felt at that surprised me with its intensity. The voice belonged to a man, low and even, the kind of tone people use when they expect to be obeyed without resistance. He said my name once, not loudly, not threateningly, just confidently, like he was certain I would respond. That certainty unsettled me more than anger ever could have. I stepped closer, stopping several feet away from the door, close enough to hear clearly but far enough to maintain distance. I asked what he wanted, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. He said he was there to check on me. That he was concerned. The word felt rehearsed, chosen for its harmlessness, and I almost laughed at the audacity of it. Concern doesn't come with late-night knocks and borrowed voices. Concern doesn't announce itself after weaponizing someone's grief. Still, I said nothing, letting the silence stretch, watching to see how he would fill it. He filled it by referencing my mother. He didn't use her name at first. He referred to her as your mom, casually, as if that familiarity granted him legitimacy. He said he knew the last few days had been hard for me, that hearing her voice again must have been emotional. My stomach turned, anger flaring hot and sharp beneath the fear. This wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an explanation. It was confirmation. He knew exactly what had happened. He wanted me to know that he knew. And that realization stripped away any remaining illusion that this might resolve itself quietly. I asked him how he got my address. The question seemed to amuse him. I could hear it in the slight pause before he answered, in the way his breath shifted. He said my mother had left behind a lot of information, said it lightly, as if discussing a box of old photographs instead of the raw material of my grief. He told me he just needed to come inside so we could clear things up. The phrasing sent a chill through me. People who need to come inside rarely need to explain why. They assume compliance. They rely on proximity to finish what they started. I told him no. The word felt powerful in my mouth, not defiant, just final. The silence that followed was different from before, tighter, edged with calculation. When he spoke again, the warmth was gone. He said he didn't want to make things uncomfortable. He said it would be easier if I cooperated. He said names then, details about my life that had nothing to do with my mother, information pulled from places I hadn't considered vulnerable. Work. Schedules. Small routines. Each detail landed like a reminder that the door between us wasn't the only boundary he had already crossed. I backed away slowly, my mind racing through options that all felt inadequate. Call the police? Yes, but not blindly. Not without understanding what I was dealing with. People who go to this level of preparation don't do it for nothing, and they don't usually rely on brute force first. They rely on leverage. The voice. The memories. The knock. This was escalation, not improvisation. And escalation meant there was something specific they wanted from me, something they believed required my cooperation rather than simple theft. When I refused again, louder this time, he sighed audibly, the sound heavy with annoyance rather than surprise. He said he was disappointed. That word, too, felt rehearsed. Then he said something that made my breath catch despite myself. He said my mother would have wanted me to help. That invoking her like that, using her as justification rather than bait, crossed a line I hadn't known was still intact. The grief surged then, sharp and immediate, but it didn't overpower me. It clarified something instead. This wasn't about honoring her. It was about exploiting the fact that I still did. I told him to leave or I would call the police. This time I meant it without hesitation. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten me. He simply told me I was making a mistake. That people who refused to cooperate often regretted it later. The calmness with which he said it was more frightening than any shouted warning. Calm implies confidence. Confidence implies backup. I moved toward the kitchen where my phone lay, my steps careful, controlled, refusing to let panic dictate my pace. The knock came again, harder this time, not violent but firm enough to rattle the frame. It wasn't an attempt to break in. It was punctuation. Emphasis. A reminder that he was still there and that time was something he believed he had. As I dialed emergency services, my hand steady despite the tremor in my chest, I realized something else with sudden clarity. The calls hadn't been about luring me outside in the dark. They'd been about softening me up, breaking down resistance, making this moment, this knock, feel inevitable rather than alarming. When I told the operator there was someone at my door who had been impersonating my deceased mother, there was a brief pause on the line. I didn't soften it. I didn't downplay it. I described everything as clearly and factually as I could, aware that the more surreal it sounded, the more important precision became. While I spoke, the voice outside stopped entirely. No movement. No sound. The quiet felt deliberate, like he was listening too, weighing his options. By the time I finished the call, the hallway outside was silent. I didn't approach the door. I didn't look through the peephole. I stayed exactly where I was, phone pressed to my ear, heart pounding, waiting for either footsteps or sirens to break the stillness. When the police arrived minutes later and found no one there, relief washed over me so intensely it made my knees weak. But beneath that relief was something colder and more durable. Understanding. Whoever had been using my mother's voice hadn't needed me to open the door after all. They needed me shaken, distracted, off balance. And standing there in my brightly lit kitchen, surrounded by the ordinary safety of my home, I understood why they'd chosen grief as their weapon. Because it almost worked. The police left just after 1 a.m, their presence fading as quietly as it had arrived, and the house settled back into a silence that felt heavier than before. I locked the door again even though it had never been unlocked, checked the windows, then checked them again, not because I thought he was still there but because my body needed the reassurance. Adrenaline has a way of leaving behind a hollow ache once it drains, and that ache sat deep in my chest as I replayed the night in slow, brutal detail. The calls. The voicemail. The text. The knock. None of it had been random. None of it had been rushed. It had been layered, each step designed to weaken me before the next one arrived. Sleep came in fragments after that, shallow and restless, my mind snapping awake at the slightest sound. When morning finally arrived, it didn't bring clarity so much as resolve. Fear had done its work, but it wasn't in control anymore. What replaced it was the need to understand. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to reach me, and people don't do that without a payoff in mind. Whatever they wanted, it wasn't emotional closure or reconciliation. It was something tangible, something worth weeks, maybe months, of preparation. I started where I should have started sooner, my mother's estate. At the time of her death, everything had felt straightforward. No vast fortune, no dramatic disputes, just paperwork and shared decisions that were exhausting but manageable. Or so I'd believed. That morning, I pulled out old folders, reread documents I hadn't looked at since the funeral, scanning them now with a suspicion that hadn't existed before. Certain names stood out. Old business contacts. A signature that looked too rushed. A transfer that had been explained quickly and never revisited. Grief has a way of making you trust people you might otherwise question. The deeper I looked, the clearer the shape of it became. My mother hadn't been wealthy, but she had been careful. She kept records. She believed in backups and redundancies. And buried among the mundane paperwork was something I'd forgotten entirely. A small storage unit she'd kept in her name, paid annually, never emptied. At the time, it had seemed like an administrative oversight, something to deal with later that eventually slipped into the background of life moving forward. Now, the timing felt anything but accidental. I drove to the storage facility that afternoon with my stomach in knots, half expecting someone to already be there waiting for me. No one was. The unit was exactly as she'd left it, boxes neatly labeled, everything methodical in that familiar way that made my throat tighten despite myself. Inside, I found documents I'd never seen before. Correspondence. Old contracts. Records of disagreements that had never made it into family conversations. My mother had been involved in a dispute years ago that she'd deliberately shielded us from, something she'd handled quietly, legally, and without drama. Someone else clearly hadn't moved on as cleanly. The realization hit slowly but decisively. The calls hadn't been about getting me to open the door for physical access to my home. That had been a test of vulnerability. What they really wanted was leverage, confirmation that I could be manipulated, that my grief could be used as a key. If I'd opened the door, it wouldn't have ended there. Cooperation would have followed. Requests framed as explanations. Demands framed as resolutions. They wanted what my mother had protected, and they believed the easiest way to get it was through me. That understanding reframed everything. The voice. The phrasing. The urgency. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was efficiency. Someone had done the math and decided that my emotional attachment to my mother was the weakest point in the chain. The fact that it almost worked filled me with a quiet, simmering anger that felt steadier than fear. They hadn't just disrespected me. They had violated her memory, twisted it into a tool, and assumed I would fold under the weight of it. In the days that followed, more pieces fell into place. A lawyer confirmed my suspicions. A pattern emerged, subtle, deliberate pressure applied where oversight was minimal. Nothing overtly illegal at first glance. Just enough ambiguity to exploit hesitation. The man at my door hadn't needed to force anything. He'd expected compliance. Expected grief to do most of the work for him. When it didn't, he disappeared, not because he was finished, but because the approach had failed. That was the moment I stopped feeling hunted and started feeling angry in a way that clarified rather than consumed me. Fear asks you to hide. Anger, when it's focused, asks you to act. I gathered everything, documents, recordings, call logs, and turned it over to professionals who knew how to deal with people like this without giving them the attention they thrived on. I stopped answering unknown numbers. I tightened boundaries I hadn't realized were porous. I stopped explaining myself to people who didn't need explanations. The most difficult part wasn't confronting the threat. It was confronting the betrayal embedded within it. Someone had taken the most private part of my life, my grief, and treated it like a weakness to exploit. That realization changed how I saw vulnerability forever. Not as something shameful, but as something that requires protection. You don't owe access to anyone just because they know your pain. And you certainly don't owe cooperation to someone who weaponizes it. What lingered most was the cold calculation behind it all. The patience. The confidence. The assumption that I would open the door because I loved my mother enough to abandon reason. That assumption was wrong, but only barely. A different night, a different state of mind, and the outcome could have been very different. Accepting that truth without spiraling into self-blame took time. I had to forgive myself for being human, for having instincts that could be exploited, for hesitating in the face of something so deeply personal. By the end of that week, the calls had stopped. The silence that followed felt different from before, not ominous, but watchful. I knew this wasn't the kind of situation that ended with apologies or neat resolutions. It ended with distance. With doors that stayed closed. With clarity that didn't require confrontation to be real. And as unsettling as the experience had been, it left me with something I hadn't expected. Control. They had tried to take it by using my mother's voice. By the time I understood what they were really after, that tactic had lost its power completely. The quiet that followed didn't feel like peace at first. It felt provisional, like a ceasefire rather than an ending. Every day for a while, I expected the phone to ring again, expected another message timed just right to slip past my defenses. But it didn't happen. The silence stretched, then settled, and somewhere in that settling I realized the fear was no longer driving my decisions. I had crossed out of the reactive phase without noticing, replaced vigilance with intention. The difference was subtle but profound. I wasn't waiting to be targeted anymore. I was choosing how much access anyone would ever have to me again. I changed things methodically, the way my mother would have. Passwords first, then accounts, then the small, overlooked details that accumulate quietly over years. I contacted people I trusted and told them only what they needed to know, not because I was ashamed of what had happened, but because I had learned the cost of overexposure. Vulnerability without boundaries isn't honesty, it's risk. That distinction felt important now. I didn't stop being open. I stopped being careless with what mattered most. The legal process moved slowly, as I'd been warned it would, but it moved. Documentation mattered. Patience mattered. Silence mattered too. The people who had tried to reach me didn't reappear, not because they had vanished from the world, but because their leverage had evaporated. Once they realized grief no longer worked as a key, there was nothing left to turn. I found a strange comfort in that. Not in the idea of winning, but in the certainty that some doors, once closed deliberately, don't invite return attempts. What lingered was the grief, but it had changed shape. For years, it had been soft and heavy, a quiet ache that flared unpredictably. After the calls, after the knock, it sharpened briefly into something raw and exposed. I had to confront it directly, without nostalgia to cushion it. And in doing so, I realized something that surprised me. My love for my mother hadn't made me weak. It had made me responsive. Someone else had tried to turn that responsiveness into a flaw, and that was their mistake, not mine. I stopped replaying the voicemail eventually. Not because it stopped affecting me, but because I no longer needed to test myself against it. I knew now what it was and what it wasn't. It wasn't her. It wasn't a message. It was an attempt. Letting it go felt like reclaiming something that had been briefly stolen. Her voice belonged to my memories, not to anyone else's agenda. That boundary felt sacred in a way I hadn't expected, and enforcing it gave me a sense of closure no explanation ever could have. There were moments, late at night, when the house still felt too quiet, when I caught myself listening for sounds that weren't there. Trauma doesn't announce when it's leaving. It fades in increments. But I no longer mistook that quiet for danger. I understood now that safety isn't about the absence of threat, it's about the presence of clarity. I knew who I was protecting, and I knew why. That knowledge steadied me in a way reassurance never had. I thought often about that first night, about how close I'd come to opening the door. Not with shame, but with respect for the complexity of being human. Love makes us reachable. Grief makes us vulnerable. Those aren't weaknesses to be eradicated, they're realities to be honored carefully. I didn't harden myself against feeling. I hardened my boundaries around it. There's a difference, and learning it changed how I move through the world. I never confronted the man who knocked, and I never tried to chase an apology or an explanation. Closure doesn't come from the people who cross unforgivable lines. It comes from deciding they no longer get to occupy your thoughts. I let the professionals handle what needed handling. I focused on living again without scanning every moment for danger. When the fear tried to resurface, I reminded myself of the most important truth the experience had given me. I had recognized manipulation in time. I had chosen myself without erasing my grief. I had closed the door. On the anniversary of my mother's death that year, I did something different. I didn't avoid the day or drown in it. I went somewhere quiet and familiar, brought flowers she would have liked, and let myself remember her without tension. No phones. No recordings. Just memory, intact and unviolated. Standing there, I felt a calm certainty settle in that I hadn't felt since before the calls. Whatever anyone had tried to take from me, they hadn't succeeded in taking this. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that boundaries aren't acts of fear. They're acts of respect. For yourself, for your past, and for the people you've loved. Opening a door out of grief doesn't make you foolish. Closing it when something feels wrong makes you wise. I didn't lose my compassion that night. I learned how to protect it. And if you've ever been targeted in a moment of vulnerability, if someone has tried to use your grief, your love, or your past as leverage, you're not alone, and you're not weak for feeling shaken by it. Strength isn't never being affected. It's recognizing when something crosses a line and choosing yourself anyway. If this story resonated with you, share your experience in the comments. Sometimes the hardest doors to close are the ones tied to love. And if you want more real stories about boundaries, betrayal, and the moments that force us to reclaim our power, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with the channel.